Well, welcome everybody anyway for coming along today. Thank you very much. And particular welcome to David Tufel from the Queensland Scout Heritage Centre from Sanford there. And there's the first phone dinging away. That'll be Len, the man who should know, sort of thing, you know. Yeah. Here's a little quote. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Okay. For those who do not know me, my name is Neville McManimm. I'm a member of RGSQ, but also of the Canungra District Historical Association. When I chose this date for the presentation, I did not realise until David pointed out to me that today, the 22nd of February, is the birthday of Baden-Powell of the Scouting movement. So that was a bit of a fluke. Founders Day. The Founders Day. Yeah. So that's just someone appeared there before to put that up there. So if I picked a date without knowing what it was. My scouting days finished in early 1965, and some things have gone from the memory, like things about Baden-Powell or whatever like that. One thing that came back to me sharply, though, was that when I met Robin, David's wife, out there at Sanford, I walked up to her and she held out a left hand to shake hands with me. And that sort of caught me off guard. Hadn't done that for a long time, sort of thing. So that sort of came back. And as you might know, it's a thing it's a scouting thing, but also I think originally back from the Zulu days, like that when you approach somebody, like people are normally right-handed. So, you know, fella's got a spear in his right hand. So if you're going to walk up to him and hold out the left hand, you're therefore trusting him that he's not going to throw the spear at you what do. So it's a trust thing, and it's a good one that sort of has carried on for all those years. I'd like to acknowledge that the initial gathering of all the information was done by Don Marshall. He started his working life as a cadet journalist for the Courier Mail, and then also worked for many years for the Queensland National Parks and Wildlife Service. Don got in touch with me via the Canungra Historical Association because he was asking about a swimming hole that he'd read about where the Scouts camped out in 1925, if we knew where that was. So we were able to tell him where that water hole was, and it's still there today, actually. So that was good. So Don later gave me the stories and the newspaper clippings that he had put together about the 1925 Scout camp, and that's where my project started from. Don's work and then my further research has a lot of information, so there's probably more to the story than what I'm liable to give you today. Some of you over the years have probably been to an Australian-wide gathering of Scouts or Guides. This is called a Jamboree. At age 14, I was lucky enough to go to a Jamboree near Sydney in 1960. In Australia in the early 1920s, they called these gatherings Corroborees, and each state took turn hosting the gathering. For 1925, it was decided that Queensland would host the event. Past events were a static gathering, but Queensland decided that the Scouts would put to the test of all they had learnt. So try to imagine 1925 public transport. Not many people had cars in those days, and people were coming from all parts of Australia. So really a lot of planning required to move everybody about. Of course, this was not just for the Scouts to gather somewhere in Brisbane. They were about to actually experience the great outdoors face-to-face with boots on the ground. It was decided to hold it in Queensland winter, as summer would be too hot. And Queensland winter was not going to be a problem for those from the southern states. Dates set were from June the 29th to July 7th, 1925. In the months leading up to the event, a newsletter was sent out to all states, suggesting how to prepare or make equipment, the food required and training required. One newsletter, and we're moving on? No, we're not moving on. We're not moving on. I normally do the arrows. Okay, one newsletter came partly written in Morse code. Now, I said that I would not have got a job with the Overland Telegraph line because it took me an hour along with the cheat sheet to sort of be able to interpret that. And there's the wording at the bottom. We just discovered our Corroboree Ground is on the site of an Aboriginal bordering, which is still visible, right near where one of the tribes will camp. Some marks left by the blacks long ago, and I hope you'll be able to read this or read their signs as easily as you read this. So, and everyone still does Morse code. So they talked about a sign that the Aborigines had, the marked tree, which was in the grounds down there. I don't know if that tree exists or not to these days. I'm not sure. Haven't gone looking. I've done a lot of looking, but I haven't found that. Only scouts who attained the first class badge were allowed to attend, as all aspects of their scouting knowledge would be judged. Points were being awarded for signs, knots, first aid, signals, memory, scouts pace, fire lighting, reporting, marksmanship, and judging distance. So if any of you have been in scouting or guiding, you know all these different things that we can go for and gain a credit for as we do. Some things from my scouting days are still with me, actually. I still use a map and compass for bushwalking, not a GPS. Yeah. I still sew on my buttons, and I iron my own shirts, which my wife loves. You know that I do that. I kept a logbook, a diaries, I suppose you want to call it. My first holiday had been about 1964, and I have numerous notes kept over my bushwalking years. I kept a diary during my 2 years of national service and all trips with family or friends since my honeymoon in 1971. So I don't have to rely on memory to relive some of the things in the past. So get your grandchildren going now, okay? Back to the Scouts. Come June, the interstate Scouts arrived by train via Wallangarra. The railway line through Kyoga wasn't open at that stage, to Brisbane Central Station. Looked a bit different back then. Then from Central Station, they got another train to a station called Rifle Range Station. It's now Gathorne, to the Army campground. Next day by train back to Central Station, and their members of the RGSQ picked them up in motor cars to show them the city sights, and then via Red Hill and Simpson's Bush Track to One Tree Hill at Mount Cootha. And here was the official welcome from Queensland Head Scout, the Governor, Sir Matthew Nathan. Now you might sort of know, you might go to Mount Cootha these days and you might stand at that lookout and see the amazing view. But if you sort of look down over the edge of the wall, there's a plaque in there noting that Commissioner Snow started the scouting movement in Queensland. The next time up Mount Cootha, just sort of get below the little bit of the wall and have a look-see around there, okay? At that day's end from Mount Cootha, back to the Army camp, the Scouts were finally told their destination for their Corroboree. It was to be held on Franklin's property on the Coomera River, a mile from the town of Canungra. This land, later in 1942, became and still is the Army Kokoda Barracks at Canungra. They were given a Corroboree booklet, a photocopy of it over there, and an original David has brought in over there. And this book gave tips on maintaining their health during the war, information on fauna and flora and geology, and also a section on astronomy. I suppose a lot of us know about the Southern Cross, and we know how to find the Southern Cross and how to find south from the Southern Cross, but there is an article in there that tells you how to tell the time from the Southern Cross. It's not a method that I learned a different method, but I'm sure this one works. I haven't tried out, but you can tell the time by the Southern Cross once you know, do a little bit of mathematics and what have you, not very complicated, as long as you know what time of the year it is, what month or what week it is. But that's in the booklet. Now, this Corroboree booklet that they were giving, they would also have to record their height in that, because that would be used later on to test their skills at the end. At the completion of the hike, they would be judged to receive it, to decide if they would receive the High Hiker's Badge. And there's one of those on display over there as well, David's brought in. To get the High Hiker's Badge, there's a few things required. They'd be judged on here. You can see the suitability of their gear, especially note being taken off own make. Speed and ease in setting up a comfortable camp, good and speedy cooking without mess or fuss, knowledge of trees and animals, care of health and cleanliness, scout spirit, and then the ease of going, that is carrying a swag, choosing good tracks, etc. So there were all these things that they would be judged on at the end of their hike. The Scouts were divided into patrols of 6 Scouts, and the patrols numbered from 1 to 40. And groups of about 13 patrols were then allotted a tribal name, giving Mudgebar, Coomera, and Ninduimba. These tribal names denoted local areas and roughly the rural place at which their hike would commence. Franklin's property was the destination, but Scouts in patrols of 6 would be dropped at various railway stations, and they had 6 days to walk to the Canungra Corroboree Ground. Along the way, they would carry their own food and equipment for the hike. So now it was finally happening. 1st of July was here. The day really began. all aboard the train at Gaythorne for Central Station. Then they marched along Edward Street, Queen Street and over Victoria Bridge to South Brisbane Railway Station. By train then on the South Coast Line. At Bethania, some of the scouts then swapped into a train for the Beaudesert line. And then from Beaudesert again, they were on the Beaudesert tramway to all lines from Josephville down to Lamington Station down there in the Christmas Creek Valley. And meanwhile, those still on the South Coast train, they were dropped at various stations from Pimpamar right through to Mudgee Vale. It was only when the scouts arrived at the designated railway station were they permitted to open sealed envelopes with the first day's hike instructions and given maps. Only one day's walk instructions were issued at a time, and in some cases, this required another patrol to arrive at the same overnight campsite, and they would hand over the instructions for the following day. So the secret of the 19 routes, some for 3 patrols, had been kept. I've only marked a couple of the routes on there. Canungra's in the middle, and coming from Mollendina Station, Pimpamar, and from the southwest in the Christmas Creek Valley. Now is the real challenge. The ultimate destination after 5 days and approximately 35 miles was on the Coomera River, 2 miles from Canungra. Today, there are no known set of hike orders and maps that went with them still in existence, but 2 of the organisers' running sheet summaries remain. After looking at present day and 1920s maps and reading the running sheets and visiting the countryside, I have plotted where in some cases I know they walked and the routes I would have hiked given the directions issued. And I'm open to any comment on those assumptions in places I got to. So I wrote that in my speech, and then yesterday, I've got here, however, having just said that about nothing being available, on checking my email yesterday morning, I've had a response from Scout Heritage South Australia. I now have the filled-in logbook of the first Renmark patrol who won the competition 99 years ago. And that's on display there. So I had to rewrite my whole stook after. That's how the plans of mice and men, So more on that logbook later on. So I'll now give a description of some of the hikes from the east and from the west. Some were easier than others, and I guess this was decided on by the age level of the scouts. Some were senior and some were rover scouts. So quoting now, our station was Oxenford. We hopped onto the platform and the train moved on. We opened our instructions and proceeded accordingly. The instructions were, go up the Coomera River, southwest 3 miles and camp. We had our maps and we were on the way. We had not gone far when we struck a bullock team with 3 large logs on the Jinka. We forded the Coomera River twice and camped on a beautiful patch of buffalo grass which formed an excellent bed. As at first ford, we had the pleasure of exchanging good turns. A teamster offered us the loan of a pony, and one chap carried most of our packs over while a couple rode over too, the rest walking, the water being just below our knees. Then we took 3 horses to the blacksmith while the teamster delivered his load of logs. Next day, we started at 10 a.m. and followed instructions, and we settled camp that day at about 12:30 on portion 3. And we spent the afternoon in games and walking along the river, also cooking a supply of damper. Here we met another patrol who had camped just a few hundred yards from us. That night, we had 1 hour good fun around the campfire, and next morning the orders were south along the west bank of the Coomera to Walker's Farm on Lot 24B. As they were given a destination as lot numbers, like 24B, I assume that they had Lands Department cadastral maps or whatever, like I just said, to be able to find some of their plots. But as I say, no maps seem to exist from that time. And they said then, we had not gone far when we met a patrol who needed iodine because of the many scratches received from the barbed wire fences, which are as numerous as trees in Queensland. But again, after fording the Coomera 3 times, passing through many plantations of arrowroot and grazing land, we reached Walker's Farm. Here we were given a rural reception by the Walkers who supplied us with milk and cream. I'll just go to another patrol for a minute. and this other patrol, they'd come from Pimpamar Station on different instructions. And they were to ascend Tamboree Mountain via another route along a track, which is now a narrow road that climbs up. It's called Mystery Road, if you know the back of it. It runs out of Queensland Gorge. It's a different way up onto Tamboree Mountain. Just be aware that some of the locals drive like they own the road, and it's sort of really sharp corners if you're ever going to find Mystery Road. At the top of Mystery Road and halfway up the side of the mountain, on a side ridge, there was a good view to the coastal plains. And this is the view as painted by a local artist, Edward Bode, back in the early 1900s. I met the fellow who just brought this painting recently, $4,000 he paid for it out of Sydney. And I met him because we were going there because this little camp set up here was actually for some timber people, because if you know then, and the fellow took me last year, down around below this, there's remains of a timber chute going down off the side of the mountain. Not a timber constructed, but you can see the gullies that the timber was shot down, and that was a little camp that the fellows that ran the chute worked to. So back to the group at the Walker's Farm. Next day, we climbed the track to Wilson's Lookout Tamboree Mountain, and that's near where the golf course is these days. And we obtained a fine view north and east for miles along the coast, as well as the mountains bordering northern New South Wales. This track they climbed is a dotted line on the 1924 topographical map here. And it's quite a climb, actually, going from 50 metres at Walker's Farm to over 500 metres elevation at the mountain within 3 kilometres. Metres, etc. I would say for people like me who still put their shoes on their feet and not on their metres, you know, that was a climb of about 1,600 feet, equivalent to about 1.5 Mount Coot-tha, actually, is what you would have been doing. Back to their quote. Then along the top of the mountain to St. Bernard's Tourist Hotel. The dogs wouldn't look at me because when they did, they started to growl. I don't know about that, but anyway, they did. As I say, they were busy there. And when they moved on to the Tamboree Post Office, and we camped near the post office. Today, it's not even there. There's a letterbox, but nothing else there anymore. The next morning, we journeyed along the top of the mountain to a place called Lay's Lookout. This was a wooden structure built on a square plan. The plaque in the park, if you ever go these days. And that's the original tower. One pole and 3 trees was sort of the way it was all put together back there. Now, that suffered a bit of bushfire and it was sort of pulled down, but it was replaced in the late 1960s, early 70s by another one. And this is the one that I remember climbing. It's no longer there either. You can see the ladders that are going up to it. They're not really workplace health and safety these days, I suppose, like that, you know. So, it was a great view over the valleys, and that's what the scouts would have got, the view looking southwest down over Canungra Township in the bottom of the valley there, looking southwest. The next morning, we journeyed along the top of the mountain to kept my place, eh? We then descended partway down the mountain. The track was tough, but we all enjoyed it. The whole of the tribe, that is 13 patrols, met on a shelf in the mountain. Being Sunday night, the tribe held a scout's own service. Next morning, we descended to the foot of the mountain through long grass and farmland. Till about 11:30, we arrived at the Corroboree Ground in time to see a bullock wagon ford the river. The ridge, roughly where I've got the arrow there now, that's where Lay's Lookout was, and there's some telecommunication towers there now. So I'm plotting that they walked down this ridge actually to about here, and then the ridge turns to the west and drops down into the Canungra Valley. Remember, there was 40 odd patrols, and some of them had slightly different routes, but they did come together towards the end of the that they would do. So the quoting also, they're saying, the tribe was welcomed by Commissioner Snow, who was the proudest man alive to see his plan carried through to that point without trouble or complaint. Now, other hikes, which I reckon were more challenging, came from the southwest. This area had more cross-country hiking, and the vegetation was different in 1925. Here's two photographs from the Canungra Valley. This is a photograph of a ridge early 1920s, and that's the same place in 2022. So you can see that they were hiking through an entirely different world back then. So all the lovely green hills we see through the valleys now were not around in 1925. Now these patrols, they started from Lamington, Hillview Station, and others down along that line towards the Christmas Creek Valley near the now Hillview Township, if you go to Hillview in the Christmas Creek Valley. That was the railway station at Lamington back in those days, nothing remaining at all of Lamington Railway Station. So their instructions were over the Jimbroken Range to the Albert River Valley to camp at the junction of the two branches of the Albert River. This had been a long day of train travel and night hiking. Remember, they got on the train at Brisbane in the morning, another train to Bedford, another train, and all stops going down the valley. And then this is what they wrote in their actual diary. We left the railway station, that's the Hillview one, at 4:30 p.m, crossing the ranges and arriving at campsite on the banks of the Albert River at 7:30. Owing to the lateness of starting, we were travelling in the moonlight. Arriving at the campsite, we had tea and immediately retired. The next day, they were to cross the ridge east of Mount Alexandra. This is Mount Alexandra running along here. And that's the valley, Albert Valley down here with Stockyard Creek in the valley there. So my looking at the ridges would have come from the back and then basically down where the sunshine is, there's a ridge that runs you into Cane Babel Valley. But crossing these ridges, this particular group got a little bit off course, they mentioned. And so I'll explain that a bit later on. So into Duck Creek Valley, and then they were to cross over. That's a ridge between Duck Creek these days. And I figured that it wasn't logged here. So this is probably what you were walking through. So you can see that you didn't really have a long range view of when you were sort of hiking to see where you were going. And this is Cane Babel Valley that they should have been heading for. But this particular group then climbed this ridge here too far to the northwest. And just starting on the top of this little lump here is Kerry Creek. And they ended up going down the valley of Kerry Creek, they say, until they get right down to that open country in the bottom, 4 miles away. And then they were back on course into the Cane Babel Creek. And from Cane Babel Creek, they were going to cross over into the Canungra Valley. And if you got some good eyesight here, down on this ridge, you can see the two white houses. To me, that's the lowest point in the ridge where I feel they would have crossed then from the Cane Babel Valley into the valley of the Canungra Creek. And that grassy ridge there, I reckon, is the point that they probably, the most obvious, very steep either side of that. So that grass ridge runs up and then it has a sharp right-hand turn to actually take you to the lowest point of the ridge to be able to sort of cross over. So as they said, Patrol 16, we'd crossed too far northwest and ended up in the Kerry Creek Valley. Another late night had them stopping at 7:45 p.m. The two ridges they had crossed that day all had at least 600 feet of up and then down to the next valley. The next day they walked along Kerry Creek for 4 miles and crossed the ridge to Cane Babel Creek to get back on track. Now that was just the first 3 days. I reckon they'd be sleeping pretty well by the sort of the end of those 3 nights. They were only averaging by their logbook about 1 mile an hour actually, but they're only doing 8 miles for the day, but they had some late starts and late finishes. And sunset in July was 5 p.m. So you can see when they were stopping camp at 7 o'clock, they were there, but the Corroboree had been planned to be around the full moon. So they did have the moonlight. And in July, that time of year, you've only got about 10 hours of daylight. So the day 4 instructions, they're in the Canungra Creek Valley now. They were to cross the Darlington Range by a track leading up to the north of Mount David. That's Mount David, and the northern part of that is just there. Now the track goes, the instructions were, the track goes from behind the house that climbs the ridge here from left to right. So that the winery you can see there now, that road runs behind us here, and then it turns and the road runs up that track there into the saddle of Mount David. They were also told to be careful to get the right track because there was difficult country on the backside, and it was. It's very steep. If you hit the wrong part of the ridge to try to come down, you would have been battling down that fairly steep stuff, and I reckon they already had Lantana in the 1920s. It wouldn't have been much fun, you know. So the obvious ridge to me coming from the saddle is this one here running down to the valley. And that would have put them into the valley where they had to be in the Coomera Valley. So they were told to go to the Coomera River and cross it by the tramway bridge. It's no longer there, of course, but the tramway was Lay's Timber Railway, which ran up the Canungra Creek Valley. Then the instructions were to inspect the Borer Ground. You might still be able to see the circle there of the Borer Ground. And it actually sits on a nice hill, actually. The view, that's looking back to Mount David. But you get good views up the valley, down the valley from this little spot. So they picked a great spot to have a little Borer ring.
Can you still see the Borer ring today?
It's hard to see. Yeah, you've got to sort of be just about down like I was last week, down on your knees, you know, to get the shape of it. The grass is coming up a little bit. It's all kikuyu, but it's coming up. But if you sort of do look, yeah, carefully, you can see the ring. So if the grass was maybe dried off a bit in winter time, it might stand out a little bit more. It actually has a reserve of its own these days. It has its own lot number and plot number and everything like that, actually. Its access is across nearly private property to get to it, but I went with a government person, you see, and he's got his uniform on and everything like that. And he said, if anybody stops you, the motto is, we are here to help. You know, that's what the government says, that sort of thing. But anyway. So then they had to follow the tramway then to Flying Fox School Reserve and camp for the night at the Flying Fox School. No longer there, Flying Fox School. But I got it verified that it is Flying Fox School. Bronwyn, you might have met Bronwyn. Bronwyn is Warwick Wilmot's wife, actually. She grew up in the valley down that way sort of thing. And so I sent the photograph to her and say, can you confirm that? And she said, yes, that is right sort of thing, you know. In those days, there used to be the headmaster's house next door and a small hall, and over the road was a cricket pitch and a tennis court, and it's all gone these days in the valley. So to talk to the locals to find out where the things. So the quoting again now, the next morning, inspection of our kit at 9 a.m. We followed the railway line along to a water reserve and pitched camp. We had signalling and bivouac test building for the trench at Millard Shield competition. And the following day, they continued more competition tests. Then the whole tribe assembled, the 13 patrols, and hiked to the Corroboree Ground. Still quoting now, we arrived at the fringe of the Corroboree Ground, or the Borer Ring, and each patrol found a numbered peg to camp by. We were re-provisioned here, and everyone was delighted to see some fresh meat, because our ration of corned beef given out in Brisbane 6 days earlier had to be withdrawn as not being good. The only hitch in a wonderfully organised affair. So how are you going? Exhausted yet? Just a walk in the park? But wait, the corroboree was not over yet. After going through all the patrol logbooks and other tests, the overall winning patrol was decided as first Renmark from South Australia. I banged this into my thing. I got this at 8 o'clock last night from Adelaide, actually, you know, anyway. So they were awarded the shield, the Trenchard Millet shield, which crossed over from each corroboree until finally it has disappeared somewhere. And people are still looking for that, I think, the last I knew, David, yeah. Now, individual scouts who were vying for the High Hikers badge that I mentioned earlier, they were judged separately. And there is a copy of a badge over there. There is a badge there. And all scouts who attended the corroboree were entitled to wear the corroboree badge. The final night of the corroboree is best described as written after the event and printed in a newspaper. Now, remember the scouting movement was based on Baden-Powell's time in South Africa, Zulu country, and also in India, and Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Books sort of thing. So many scouting words, particularly then, were not Australian Aboriginal. Now, the Ingonyama chorus, you might have heard that, Ingonya. If you've seen the Lion King movie and whatever have you, and that singing at the beginning, the Ingonyama chorus, it literally means lion in Zulu, and it's the title of the Zulu king, actually. Now, this final night would take some recreation, but let me paint a picture, hopefully in your mind's eye. During the day, final instructions were given, and the boys were all ready for the great event to be carried out just as it had been by the natives for ages past in the same spot. Darkness came on, and orders were issued that each of the three tribes were to take up their position in the forest, and it was a sight to see. Hundreds of scouts wearing their blankets, carrying their staff, a spear, some with shields, trooping off. I lay in my blanket and listened. For half an hour, there was absolute silence. And just as the full moon rose, the drums started beating. Then the Ingonyama chorus started, very softly at first, getting louder and louder until it became a regular roar of voices, then softer and softer again another 5 times, and the chorus in almost a whisper. Silence again, and then the drum started once more that weird beat. It was a weird scene, this white youth corroboree, and it was a memorable conclusion to a memorable week in the history of Boy Scout movement in Australia. To most of the boys, the ceremony was doubtless all part of the great game, but to many of the older folk, the whole thing was uncanny. So you can imagine it, a host of shrouded figures, half hidden in the gloom by a background of tall gums, the moonbeams throwing a sheen of unreality on the clearing in the centre, of which stood a vague pile of timber, largely all silent. Then the big chief gave instructions for the fire of brotherhood and welcome to be lighted, and the keepers of the fire obeyed. It was the old method of lighting the fire with rubbing sticks together. And as the boy swung the cord and secured the sparks, a flickering blaze and then a sheet of flame flared heavenward, followed by a murmuring chant, quickly rising to a crescendo in a weird waving mass of humans encircling the blaze to the frantic beating of the tom. Do you think any boys got to sleep last night? That night? I reckon the adrenaline would have been really pumping, what I sort of feel. The next morning, camp was broken. They marched over the hill to Canungra railway station, where there was a special train waiting to take them back to Brisbane. At South Brisbane Station, they marched over Victoria Bridge, down Queen Street to Central Station for the train back to Gaythorne. The following day, back to Central Station to board the train for Sydney and points beyond. So I had to go. Would you like to be a Boy Scout in 1925? That's my story, thank you. Yeah.